My marriage is dead because my wife had a baby today. I'm 90% sure he's dead, but I'll get confirmation in a few hours. Normally it takes longer, but due to the circumstances, the hospital rushed the DNA test. Of course, I'm sure it won't change anything. My phone tears up on the table as I sit at a bar 10 minutes away from the hospital. I keep staring at the screen even though I know the doctor won't call me for at least a few more hours. The calls I ignore come from my wife, kids, and in-laws. I'm sure they all want to know what the hell is going on. Indeed, so do I. The baby is absolutely beautiful, with blonde curls just like her mother. She was born weighing 7 pounds 12 ounces and 19 inches long, a perfect premature baby. Except according to my wife, she was at least 6 weeks premature. Granted, I don't have a medical degree, but I'm not a half-breed either. A baby born that early wouldn't have looked so perfect in its development and coloring. My wife had lied to me, and now that I had removed the blinders of absolute love, I realized that my greatest fear had come true. The child she had tried to pass off as mine was actually the offspring of my late best friend. The waitress leaves me a fifth Jack Daniels. At this rate, I'm going to spend $150 on a bottle that sells for $25. I just don't care. I slip back into my coma. The three amigos were a lifetime ago. Literally, if you believe Gary. He, Tracy, and I have been inseparable since our families moved into the same neighborhood for 2 years when we were 5 years old. Gary's family and I moved one summer, and Tracy's family moved the following spring. Gary and I had become friends by then, but Tracy had no problem fitting in because she was a total tomboy at the time. She ran faster than me and was stronger than Gary, and there wasn't a sport or game we didn't play without her. When the other girls in the neighborhood were playing with dolls, Tracy would play kickball or stickball with Gary, me and the other neighborhood boys, not just her. When we became teenagers, things changed somewhat. In particular, Tracy changed physically. She went from a skinny blonde with long pigtails to a young lady. Gary and I noticed this change, but we never talked about it out loud for fear that Tracy would drag us down into the mud. Although a year later, we were still inseparable, I certainly didn't mind the rare occasions when Gary wasn't around for one reason or another. In those moments, Tracy and I seemed closer, both physically and mentally. And in fact, I received my first kiss one summer Sunday afternoon when Gary was somewhere with his family, and Tracy and I were sitting together on a swing on my front porch. I don't even remember what we were talking about, but suddenly she leaned toward me and kissed me gently on the lips. Her lips were full and soft and tasted like the strawberry chapstick she used all the time. And my brain suddenly mimicked very successfully how the TV loses reception and gets completely snowed in. "Wow," I whispered, completely unable to say anything else. Tracy blushed as our eyes met. I reached out with my left hand and took her right hand in mine, and we just sat together and swayed. Gary returned to our house the next day, and if I hadn't been involved in the kiss the day before, there was no way I would have believed it had taken place. Tracy was back to her normal, reserved demeanor without the slightest hint that anything else had happened. At one point, I even tried to take her hand in mine, but she very calmly pulled away. I was puzzled, to say the least. The freshman Christmas dance was approaching, and I figured it was the perfect time to make an official move towards Tracy. She, Gary, and I were walking home from school when I swallowed twice hard and then asked, "Trace, if you're not doing anything next month, would you like to go to the Christmas dance with me?" Tracy, who had been standing between Gary and me as we walked, stopped, which made Gary and I stop as well. I noticed a smirk appear on Gary's face when we stopped. I, uh, I'm going with Gary. He asked me yesterday, Bobby." Tracy looked awkward, Gary smirked, and I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "Sorry, Bobby. You oversleep, you lose," Gary snorted. I felt stupid. One, I had no idea what Gary thought of Tracy, and two, because it was one of those unwritten male codes. You can't have a relationship with another man's girlfriend, even if I just found out about it. "Hey, Gar, I didn't mean anything when I asked. I didn't know, bud." "I got it, Bobby. We're all right," he said cheerfully. The rest of the way home, Tracy fidgeted and looked awkward. She and Gary made small talk, and I kept quiet. I didn't ask anyone else to the dance or go to the bachelor party. Yes, I felt betrayed by both of my best friends. My father had seen me moping around the house the night of the dance and knew the reason why. My parents were in the family room watching TV, and I was in my bedroom listening to music on the CD player when there was a quiet knock on the door and my dad poked his head inside. "Girls, huh?" he said, coming in and sitting down in the chair behind my desk. "You can't live with them, but you can't kill them either." I shook my head to chase away the cobwebs. I looked at him like he'd just stepped off the moon. He grinned crookedly, which I knew so well. "Thanks, Dad. Good talk," I said. After the Christmas dance, the three amigos turned into the two amigos and their friend. We still practiced together, but Tracy and Gary were now an official couple. They remained that way throughout middle school. Eventually, I started dating other girls. It was college that finally separated the two amigos. Tracy went to Michigan State and Gary went to UCLA. I ended up at Michigan State too, but because I was fiddling with the guy code myself, I barely interacted with Tracy my freshman year. She seemed puzzled by this development, but I didn't want anyone to accuse me of trying to steal her away from Gary. One day, Tracy's mom came up to me and asked me if I was mad at her daughter. Rhonda and Mark Ford were practically like parents to me, and I respected them as much as I respected my own parents. "She misses the old days, Bobby," Mrs. F told me. "It can't be like that anymore. Mrs. F, we're not 7 years old anymore. And besides, if she's not dating me, I can't imagine anyone better than Gary," I replied. Things didn't change during sophomore year, but at the end of my junior year, Tracy invited me to be her date to a formal event of her sorority. I was both surprised and wary. "Tracy, aren't you still dating Gary?" I asked. "I really don't want to come between you two." "Gary and I broke up after the summer," she said. "He told me he was going to stay in California after graduation to go to law school and didn't want to keep me for another 3 years. "To law school? Gary? I didn't see that coming," I said. Our first date was tentative at best. She asked if I wanted to ask her out on a second date. We dated for the next 2 years before getting married. Although I was against it, Gary was my best man. It was a little awkward for both of us. After all, asking a guy who had previously dated and banged the woman you're marrying to be your best man isn't exactly standard procedure. Right after the wedding, Gary moved back to California, and I didn't think of him for over 20 years. Our daughter Kaylee was born 2 years after we were married. Our son, Jeffrey, was born another 2 years later. We found out about Gary's becoming infrequent at home a few days later from my mom. Our parents still lived on the same block, and Mrs. Prescott told my mom that Gary had come home to say goodbye. He had cancer and had less than a year to live, so he wanted to see his parents while he was still in good physical shape. My mom asked his mom if we could have a reunion so he could see his old friends and other relatives. His mom thought it was a great idea. Gary was in the first stage of treatment and still looked pretty good, although it was obvious that he was incredibly depressed. He was single, twice divorced, and had no children. He, Tracy, and I must have spent at least 6 hours talking about life, his life in particular, and how it would end. Near the end of the evening, Tracy had the thought that would eventually destroy our marriage. "How about we come over and take care of you until it's time for you to go into hospice care?" asked Tracy to Gary. Gary and I were shocked at what Tracy suggested. She and I hadn't talked about it, and at first glance I didn't see how we could even bring it to fruition. "He's our oldest friend, Bobby. Who else should do it?" "But the doctors say I have a few more months before I need hospice care," Gary pointed out. "Of course you guys can't quit your jobs and sit with me. I mean, you're paying for 2 kids in college right now." "I work for a national insurance company that handles family vacations," Tracy explained. "Bobby can use his vacation and get some personal time." "That's probably about 2 months total, hon," I said. "That's not enough." "Well, you could take a week at a time and stretch that out to 4 months. The rest of the time I can manage on my own." I didn't like where this was going. I knew Gary was our oldest friend, but my wife had just volunteered to spend a few months away from me and our home to take care of him. And since she'd done it right in front of him, that meant I had to look like the world's biggest villain to refuse her offer. And yet, "Tracy, that's a bold commitment," I started to say, but she interrupted me with a fierce glare. "Then it's settled. That's what we'll do." I swallowed hard and bit my tongue. That night, I barely made it through the door before I exploded. "What the hell, Tracy? You're going to leave me for 6 months or so to play babysitter to an ex-boyfriend? You selfish bastard, she yelled at me. Is that what this is about? You can't get over the fact that he slept with me before you did. That night, I slept in Jeffrey's old bedroom. It took us 3 days to come to some sort of agreement to help Gary, which in the language of spouses means that Tracy got her way, and we did exactly what she promised Gary we would do. Gary was humbled and grateful. I can't even begin to guess how many times he thanked Tracy and me. I have to admit that after the first month, I felt like a bit of a selfish chump. I also have to admit that after the first month of working, taking care of the house, and helping Tracy take care of Gary, who had both good and bad days, I was very tired. Maybe it was because I was tired, but by the second month, I felt that something was wrong between Tracy and me. I realized that she had to be tired from everything she did for Gary, sometimes even more than I thought she should be, so I didn't spend too much time worrying about it. I was more concerned with the looks Tracy and Gary slyly exchanged the few times I was around, as if they had their own special language. Things went smoothly for the next 2 months. A few times I felt like I was imposing on their time together. I was also somewhat surprised that Tracy seemed somewhat reticent about our contact. After a week apart, I was ready to throw myself into her arms, but she seemed bored. I again chalked it up to mental and physical fatigue. 4 months later, my days came to an end, and although Gary's condition had deteriorated, I knew he had a lot of good times ahead of him. Tracy would have to pull everything herself, and I would have to resign myself to being alone for a month or more. When I ran out of vacation time, our daughter Kaylee threw herself into helping out, which I thought was great since Gary was her godfather. She spent 2 different weeks helping Mom. After about a month, Gary had to be put into hospice, and then another month passed and he was gone. I flew to California again for the funeral. Tracy was just as inconsolable as Gary's parents. Both of his parents thanked Tracy and me endlessly for helping Gary. I deflected most of the thanks in my wife's direction. For the first week after coming home, Tracy acted almost aloof with me, which I attributed to grief. Then it was as if a switch had been flipped, and for the next 3 weeks we made love every single day. I felt like a child again. A month after we came home, I got the shock of my life when Tracy came out of our bathroom with a positive pregnancy test. Thinking back on it, I should have been shocked that she didn't look shocked herself, but I was too busy trying to stay on my feet after her announcement. Tracy and I were both 45 years old. Our kids were 22 and 20. And wait, wasn't she on the pill? I'm sorry, babe, but I forgot to bring the pills with me to California. And once I got used to taking them, I didn't bring it up again when I got home. You know, none of us believe in abortion. We can do it again, you and me. I heard myself agreeing with her somewhere inside me. Damn it, I was going to be a father again. For about a week, I walked around with a silly grin on my face. When my daughter came home for the long weekend, she and Tracy went maternity and baby shopping. We had long since thrown out and given away everything left over from our previous children. The girls came home cheerful and joking, and I must have carried a dozen bags out of the car. The girls quickly made dinner, and we all laughed while Tracy gave her random thoughts on the difference between what she buys today and what was available a couple decades ago. She also mentioned that she doesn't feel completely comfortable in the maternity clothes she buys because they were all made for women 10, 20 years younger than her and make her feel a little out of place. Well, Mom, you can't help it if you're a feminine woman and someone took it literally, Kaylee laughed. I saw Tracy frown quickly, mulling over her comment. It didn't escape me that Kaylee had said someone and not Daddy. It wasn't a casual comment, and my stomach rumbled. I remembered the discomfort I'd felt when I'd gone to California to help Gary. I kept my thoughts to myself, but kept my eyes open the rest of the weekend. I heard a few more comments that I knew had two meanings, and I wondered who my daughter was addressing, me or my wife. One day when Tracy wasn't in the room, I subtly tried to find out by asking Kaylee how she felt about being a sister again, after all these years. I knew she was straining to think of how to answer me. Her eyes looked anywhere but at me for about 30 seconds. Then a giggle escaped her lips, which she managed to cover with a fake cough. I think it's great that Mom is such a woman and you're such a stud. She looked uncomfortable and found a reason to leave the room quickly. I grabbed 2 more Rolaids from the pack I had started carrying around for the last week. Tracy was getting bigger and, in my opinion, prettier each week, although I continued to feel uneasy. I just couldn't figure out what was wrong, or maybe I just didn't want to figure out what was wrong. A few months later, I was in the office when I got an unexpected call from Tracy, who had taken an unpaid leave of absence and was back at work after only 3 months. "Hey, Dad, how about I give the girl a ride to the hospital today?" she asked in a sultry voice. Since, as far as I knew, Tracy was 6 or 6.5 months pregnant, and the tone of her voice was incredibly pleasant, I had no idea what she was asking me. "Why in the hospital, hon? Did something happen?" I asked with more than a little concern in my voice. "Well, baby, my water broke, and I'm just too lazy to go to the hospital," she purred. "Oh, shit," was all I could reply. I grabbed my car keys, ran into my boss's office to tell him my news, and ran to my car. I lived 15 minutes away from the office, but I had to drive 12 minutes that day. I kept thinking that Tracy was being awfully careless, considering she was only 6.5 months old. I knew that premature labor is not the best for a baby's health. I couldn't believe how calm Tracy had been when I got home, but apparently having 2 more babies had given her confidence. I was even more nervous than I had been at the birth of the first 2 babies. 10 hours later, I became a father to a beautiful, perfect second daughter. The longing in my stomach couldn't even explain how bad I suddenly felt. After the nurse took the baby to wash her, she started to hand her to me, but I instinctively recoiled, much to the nurse's shock. "It's a full-term baby, isn't it, Doc?" I asked in almost a whisper. He looked at me, then at Tracy, who was still being cleaned by another nurse. They exchanged meaningful glances, then I saw Tracy shake her head, almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marsley, but I don't have permission to discuss the baby's health with you. You are not on the confidentiality list. It's a HIPAA requirement," he replied. I'm not proud of myself, but at that moment I lost my head. "Screw HIPAA," I shouted while he and all the nurses in the delivery room jumped back. "If this is my baby, I have every right to ask about her health, and if she's not mine and you know it, you can't put my name on the birth certificate without my permission, and you sure as hell don't have it. Now give me a damn DNA test." It was deathly quiet as I turned on my heel and walked out of the delivery room, shedding my maternity clothes as I went. As I left the hospital, I caught a glimpse of my parents and Tracy's parents in the delivery room. I lingered at the bar for my sixth and seventh drink and a hamburger. By this point, I had gotten calls from just about everyone who was anyone in my life, except for the doctor with the DNA test results. I guess that Tracy didn't want to waste anyone's time, because by this point, everything had already been decided. For crying out loud. I guess 7 shots of Jack and a ton of stress is more important than having someone else's baby with my wife, because I slept like a killer that night. My voicemail and message boxes were completely full. Assuming nothing happened after I left, I should have brought Tracy and the baby home today. I showered and headed to the hospital, feeling like someone was beating the shit out of my head and stomach. Tracy was breastfeeding the baby when I got to her room. I walked in, and without further ado, I lowered myself into the chair by her bed. The baby was napping, so Tracy unhooked her and put her in the bassinet by the bed. "I don't even know where to begin, Bobby," Tracy said quietly as her eyes began to fill with tears. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I went there to help him and be his friend. Honestly. But then he had a few bad days in a row, and at one point he cried in my arms, and then we ended up in bed and everything was fine, just like it used to be. And once that happened one day, everything was so easy except when you came down to help. Then you and I slept together again, and it was awkward and I felt guilty, but I didn't know how to stop. Or maybe I didn't want it to stop. We slept together for 4 months, the last 2 without a break since you weren't around. But honestly, you and I made love even when I wasn't on the pill, and you could have gotten me pregnant just as easily, only it didn't happen." As she told me her story, she kept her eyes on the baby. I slowly absorbed her words until she said, "Wait, you had fun with Gary while Kaylee was visiting?" I asked in a daze. Tracy blushed, and it took all my stamina not to choke her. "She knew and didn't say a word to me," I exclaimed in utter frustration. "Say you at least threatened her or bribed her in some way? That can't be true." "Jeffrey knew too. And our parents? Does the whole world really know I'm a goddamned cuckold?" Tracy's eyes widened and tears slowly rolled from her eyes. I know my daughter Bobby. I just knew she would understand, so we never tried to hide it from her. Yes, I asked her not to tell anyone. I told her it was on my conscience, Tracy said. No, Jeffrey didn't know and still doesn't know. No one knows but you, me, and Kaylee. I want to keep it that way too, so we can do whatever we need to do for Bobby Geraldine. I know she's not technically yours, but she is now. And we should be as much parents to her as we are to Kaylee and Jeffrey. We are her parents. End of story. End of story. We're doing this for her and in honor of our best friend. Best friend? I asked. I clearly wasn't his best friend, or he wouldn't have been able to sleep with my wife. You can't do that to a best friend. He was dying, Bobby. It's not like he and I never did it. Yeah, but you had no contact with him while you were married to me, unless you want to tell me something else. Her blue eyes were almost glowing with anger. No, no. Bobby Geraldine? Really? Is that supposed to soften me up? What's her last name? Bobby Geraldine Martin. That's my last name too, remember? But her birth certificate lists her as Gary's daughter, though no one but you and me should see that document if you still intend not to be listed as her father. Oh yes, I wheezed. Why is that, Bobby? He was our best friend. Now he's gone. I gave him comfort and love in his last days. Is that such a bad thing? You speak of it with such sympathy, but you were a married woman. You crossed the line in your compassion. You didn't ask me before you broke your vows, violated our trust, and disrespected me. Yes, I realize this is your body and you don't belong to me, but we took a vow of loyalty before God and our families. At least we should have discussed it first. Our vows were not made in a vacuum. And there's no way in hell I'm going to raise a child that another man fathered with my unfaithful wife. It's Gary's baby, Tracy whined. You wouldn't think twice about raising her if Gary did and she was left alone. No, I wouldn't, but I never agreed to raise his child with you, I said sadly. You know I love you, Bobby. I don't want to lose you and what we have because of this. A mistake, I said, finishing her sentence. No, I wasn't going to say that, she replied. Okay, maybe it wasn't the best decision of my life, but I'm not going to call it a mistake. The mistake is that we didn't talk about it first, and that's my fault. We didn't talk about it first because you knew I would never agree to you sleeping with Gary, let alone having a baby with him, I growled. And if it weren't for the fact that you got knocked up, you'd probably never have told me about the sex. Despite what you say, it started. You made a willful decision to keep doing it, and you even did it in front of our daughter. I know how to spell the word humiliation, and it's Bobby. Thank you so much. Now, Kaylee and Jeffrey came home from college the following weekend to see their new sibling. When my daughter walked into the house, I went cold at best and she looked guilty. That night, Kaylee and I cooked dinner together after she and Jeffrey talked about the baby for about an hour. She didn't look at me directly once the entire time we maneuvered through the kitchen, and it was pretty quiet. After we ate, Jeffrey put the dishes away, and I took Kaylee's hand and led her out to the back patio so we could talk privately. We barely had time to sink into our chairs before I was already letting her do it. You knew she was cheating on me and you didn't say a word, I growled. Kaylee jumped back from my outburst and her eyes started to water. She lowered her eyes and started to say something and finally looked up at my exhausted face. I thought it was great what you and Mom were doing for Uncle Gary. And then when Mom did what she did, well, I was a little shocked at first, but when I thought about it, I began to think of it as courageous, sad, compassionate, loving, and tragic. It was almost like Shakespeare. I didn't even think about the fact that she might be pregnant. I thought he was too sick for that, plus I assumed she was on birth control. Compassionate friend or cheating whore. I guess those are my options, I spat at her as she cried. Eat shit, Bill Shakespeare. What about the tragedy my marriage turned into? You didn't think about good old Dad? Of course not. Sunday afternoon, the kids went back to college. After that, it was just the three of us, and the house got pretty damn quiet. Several times over the next few days, Tracy tried to ask me to help with the baby, if only just to hold him for a few minutes. I refused each time, much to her dismay. You'll be playing with me at 5. She yelled at me once when I asked her to hold the baby for a minute for some reason. Grow the hell up. Put your big boy pants on. In all the years we'd been together, Tracy had probably never uttered the F word more than a few times to me. I knew she was angry, but that wasn't my problem. I looked at her like a zombie and silently walked out of the room. Work was my solace. I was able to be away from home for 40 hours a week. When I was home, I was often alone. I had to make a lot of decisions. I knew I shouldn't punish the child, that she wasn't guilty of anything. But at the same time, it wasn't my concern. She was Tracy's concern. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that divorce was my only option. I couldn't accept Tracy's betrayal and disrespect. And every time I looked at the baby, the image of Tracy and Gary dealing with it came into my mind. When I got home, I found Tracy sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the contents of a large envelope spread out in front of her. She was sniffling and crying. "I guess I'll order something to go. Pepperoni pizza and breadsticks, okay?" I said quietly as I entered the room. "Is that what you're worried about, dinner?" She spat out, and there was venom in her tone. "You don't love me anymore?" I sighed heavily, picked up my cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. "Not as much as I did a few weeks ago," I replied. "You don't or can't realize you blew it when you spread your legs for our best friend. If I were you, I'd get myself a lawyer and tell Gary's parents that they have a granddaughter. I'm sure they'd be thrilled. You know I don't want a divorce. I love you. I want you to calm down and think about it. Would you be better off alone? I doubt it. Think about it, darling." "That's all I'm thinking about. This isn't about me. It's about you breaking our vows and ripping my heart out," I said. "But if you love me, isn't there forgiveness in your heart? We can get through this. We have to be together, Bobby, and you know it." I thought I knew that, but this isn't a case where you can just say, "I'm sorry," and things will magically get better. 24 years wasted. My first call was to my son. I explained the nature of Tracy's actions and that the baby was Gary's child. He listened in silence, then I heard a whispered, "Damn." I told him I had filed for divorce. "I hope so, Dad. This is absolute shit. What was Mom thinking?" He tried to comfort me. I could see that he was very angry with his mother. I tried to calm him down by reminding him that despite what Tracy had done to me, I knew she still loved him as much as she did. He asked what I was going to do with the baby. "Absolutely nothing. Neither financially nor emotionally do I need to support him or worry about him. I know financially I'll be fine," I replied. "Help look after your sister." Half-sister, dad, half-sister. I didn't say anything to my parents until the day Tracy was sued. My father was angry at both of us, at Tracy for her betrayal and at me for agreeing to leave Tracy alone with Gary for any length of time. "You knew they had a thing for each other years ago. I can't believe you were that naive, even though you trusted her completely. Come on, man. You know you can't trust any man when it comes to your woman." I had to admit that he was right. I should have fought harder to keep Tracy from being alone with Gary. At least that was on my conscience. Mom saw things very differently than Dad did. In her opinion, I was wrong to dump Tracy and not try to reconcile. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said quietly to me as Dad sat back and frowned. "Mom, a mistake would have been if she'd slept with him once. Sleeping with him for 4 months was a conscious decision. It can hardly be called a mistake. And sleeping with him without birth control, unfathomable," I said. "And yet, Bobby, you know you still love her, and she's going to need help raising the baby. That's your job, Robert. By the way, I'll still consider this child my third grandchild." Aside from her voice, the fact that Mom called me by my legal name spoke volumes that she was on Tracy's side. Dad looked at the ceiling, then back at me. He knew he was going to have to experience hell from her later. I didn't bother calling Kaylee. I figured Tracy would call her first after she was served. My thought was confirmed when an annoyed Kaylee called me later that afternoon. "Uncle Gary is dead, Daddy. She can't take it all back now. Move forward. You and Mom still love each other, and now there's a baby too. Be a man for Mom and Bobby G," she practically commanded. Wise advice from a man who didn't see fit to tell his own father about his mother cheating on him with another man. "Somehow I don't have to worry about what you think anymore," I replied. I later learned that Gary's parents were shocked and overjoyed to learn that they had a grandson. They were upset that Tracy had planned to keep the news a secret, but told her they understood her reasoning. A day later, they called me and asked me to stay with Tracy and raise Gary's daughter. They knew we had been very close over the years and felt I was the best person to be a father to Gary's daughter. Thank you for your confidence and compliment, but I am not that person. I have to admit that I'm so angry with Gary and Tracy that I can't keep my eyes open. I could practically feel Gary's parents screaming as the line went dead. I was embarrassed, but not that embarrassed. I was being honest. Of course, my relatives called too. They too begged me to stay with Tracy. They understood that what she had done was horrible and stupid, but they were sure that she still loved me and wanted to raise her child with me. I thanked them for their concern, but told them I didn't know if I could ever get over the horrible and stupid thing. Of course, Tracy fought the divorce. She and her attorney managed to get 12 joint counseling sessions scheduled. I realized I had no choice, but I wasn't going to be a wimp during the sessions. Jocelyn McAdams, Ph.D., looked very prim and professional when I entered her office. By my estimation, she was about 10 years older than Tracy and me, and she was wearing a gray blazer over a very businesslike skirt, which I noticed when she stood up to greet me with a firm handshake. Tracy was already sitting in a chair to my right in front of a large desk. She had asked Tracy to tell her side of the story first, and since I knew her, I guess I went off into my own little world. I'm sure Tracy emphasized compassion and downplayed the cheating. Anyway, in the next instant, Doc brought me out of my reverie. I had assumed, erroneously as it turned out, that I had my own part of the story to tell. Mr. Martin, it seems to me that you are the one with the power. You can save your marriage and your family if you act like an elder, put your ego aside, and try to get back to the way things were between you and Tracy. Now that was something I didn't expect from a man who was supposed to be a professional. Almost everyone had the same attitude. I had to accept what had happened. Had I fallen into an alternate universe? Wait, Doc, I started before she interrupted me. Dr. McAdams, please, we're going to take a professional approach. I don't want either of you to treat me as a personal friend or ally. Is that your main thing, Dr. McAdams? Is that your main thing? I think you've already picked a side without even hearing my story. I stood up, turned around, and walked out. On the way home, I called the lawyer and told him he needed to find a neutral counselor or I wouldn't be attending any more sessions. The second counselor at least listened to my story after accepting Tracy's story, but I knew I was still adrift. You admitted that you still love your wife, Mr. Martin. Your wife still loves you very much, and now you have a child. What do you need to do to rebuild your family? Dr. Lauren Avent asked. Dr. Lauren Avent asked. First of all, we were never a family. This is not my child. I'm not raising someone else's child, I said. So this is about your ego? Dr. Avent said with a more than smug expression on her thin face. I can't win with you guys, can I? I asked with more than a little disgust in my voice. Why is this even about me? Let me paint you a picture with words, and I'll speak slowly so you understand. I'm not the one who cheated on my spouse and broke my vows by doing it with another man, and I'm not the one who gave birth to another man's child. You need to ask her why she made the choices she did and what she thinks she can do to overcome those bad choices, if anything. I looked in Tracy's direction and saw that she was frowning. I could see the counselor struggling to keep a blank face. Like the old Monty Python joke, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition, and I wasn't expecting it. Mr. Martin, if you divorce your wife and in the future marry another woman who already has children, won't you raise someone else's child? Dr. Avent asked. Well, I think you get my point, Doc. But in Tracy's case, the child was conceived while she was married to me, which I think is a pretty big difference, don't you? She nodded slightly, but apparently wasn't finished yet. But since the man died before the child was born, don't we disagree? Aren't you being petty about it? Dr. Avent said. Petty? Petty is when you know what you did was wrong, but you choose to lie by keeping silent about it. She didn't admit anything to me until I caught her. She started to continue, but I was already done. Look, Doc, this is ridiculous. Yes, I still love her. You can't undo that right away. But how can she say she loves me when she cheated on me, got me pregnant, and tried to pass the baby off as mine? She may love me a little, but if she loved me as much as she says she does, it wouldn't have happened. This wasn't a one-time thing, Doc. she and her lover had sexual intercourse more than once. She tells everyone now that it was purely out of compassion. He was a close friend, and he was dying. Well, if it was so compassionate, why didn't she come to me, her husband, and discuss this decision with me? Because she knew the answer. I would say no, and she knew it. I realize it's her body, and she probably thinks she can do whatever she wants with it. But as soon as we said our vows, she gave up her right to unilaterally give her body to another man, at least without discussing it and or letting me know how I should proceed if I ever wanted to give my body to another woman for whatever reason. Once we made our vows to each other, we no longer operate in a vacuum. It's simple, Doc. Doc sat with the look of a comatose man, only with her eyes open. For a few seconds, she tapped her finger on the clipboard. So you have enough love left to at least try to be a husband and father? You say you have love left for your wife. The biological father of the child is dead. There's no reason to make her a victim, Dr. Evans said. Step forward? Nice wording, Doc. Attack my manhood. Try guilt. My wife and our best friend deliberately ripped my heart out, Doc. If he were alive right now, I'd punch him in the face. My love for her grows weaker by the minute. A child? Unfortunate, but not my problem. Translation. No chance of saving this marriage. We had a second session with the counselor. I said nothing but hello and goodbye. Tracy whimpered, tensed up, and cried. I can see you're not going to concede or even think about it, Mr. Martin. I'll tell the judge we're done. Thanks, Doc. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, just in time for Christmas. We lived in a no-fault divorce state, so we split everything equally, except that Tracy was paying me for my half of the house, which was fine with me since she had a child to raise. Gary had left us most of his property when he died, so Tracy had the money for the house. She also got several years of child support since I was making more money than she was. Although my son was still on my side, so to speak, I knew he wanted to spend Christmas with as many relatives as possible, meaning his mother, sister, and younger half-sister. I told him I was okay with that, and we would celebrate New Year's Eve together. 2 days before Christmas, I stopped by my former home to drop off presents to everyone, including my ex-wife and her baby. It wasn't much for Tracy and the baby, but I didn't want to look petty in front of my kids. Tracy was surprised to see me at first when she opened the door, holding Bobby Geraldine in her arms. She looked surprised at my 2 bags of gifts and hesitantly let me into the house. She led me into the living room where there was a Christmas tree and everything was decorated the way we always did. The only difference was that I didn't do the setting up and decorating like I usually did. Tracy saw the look on my face as I looked at the decorations and held back a tear. How about some eggnog, Bobby, and then I'll put the bags under the tree. Could you hold the baby for a minute? I wanted to be rude, I really did, but I couldn't. I hesitantly reached out my hands and took the baby. Her baby, with Gary's baby. I held back the bile that started to rise from my stomach when she went to get the eggnog. I stood like that, holding the baby straight away from my body like she was some kind of explosive device for about 30 seconds, then took her in my right hand like I used to do with my children long ago, and sat down in the chair. Tracy came in with 2 glasses of eggnog, one for each of us, and sat down in the second chair in the room, smiling at me when she saw the baby in my hand. This brings back a lot of memories, Bobby. You were always so kind to children when they were little, she said softly. It's not every man's gift to know how to handle babies and toddlers. I smiled shyly. The baby was beautiful, echoing her beautiful mother in many ways, but I could never feel comfortable with her, given the circumstances. If a man doesn't forget, can he ever forgive? I don't think so, although I know many people, especially in my family, disagree with me. We chatted some more, and then Tracy picked up 2 bags of presents and started stacking them under the tree. When she got to the first bag with Bobby Geraldine's name on it, she stopped with an amused expression on her face. You didn't have to include it, Bobby, Tracy said as a tear rolled down her face. Christmas is a holiday for kids of all ages, baby. I couldn't leave out your little girl. I looked at the little girl in my hand. Under the right circumstances, she could be mine. I felt a lump in my throat. Damn it. I couldn't hate the child even though I hated what her mother had done. I was sure Tracy hadn't accidentally handed the baby to me. Tracy gasped again when she found the first package with her name on it. Oh, Bobby, really? You shouldn't have. I really wasn't expecting anything. I, I didn't get you anything. I'm sorry. Don't worry about anything, Tracy. I just want you to have a great Christmas. You know, you can come in person. You'll be welcome. We'll have more than enough food. I know the kids will love it too, she said. Not this time, Trace. Maybe a year from now. It's too soon. Too soon for my mind and heart. Tracy lowered her eyes. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was being honest. My wounds still ached. On Christmas Eve, I found myself at Barnes& Noble late at night. I was reading a new Clive Cussler book I'd bought for myself and drinking a mint mocha latte at the Starbucks located inside the bookstore. Looking around, I found two other losers who were also reading at Starbucks. They practically had to kick me and two other losers out when they finally closed. I went home to a quiet house, but I was ready. I had bought chicken salad the day before and made some toast to spread on. Ruffles chips and Don Julio tequila completed the meal. Hell, I know how to live. Christmas morning, I woke up with a slight hangover. 4 aspirin tablets, a couple of cinnamon Pop-Tarts, and 3 cups of coffee later, I was ready for the big Christmas feast. Here's just one problem. I didn't have a holiday party plan. I went to my parents' house and the three of us enjoyed my mom's baked ham dinner and a few gifts. My kids had given the gifts for me to my parents when they found out I was coming to the party. After dinner, we drank hot chocolate with peppermint schnapps. I must admit that memories of past Christmases when we were a family were swarming in my mind. I admitted to myself that I still loved Tracy to some extent, and I had my doubts that I had made the right move. Apparently, I wasn't the only one thinking about my past life. We hope you don't mind, Bobby, but Dad and I consider Bobby Geraldine our granddaughter, and we bought Christmas presents for her, Mom said to break the silence in the room. He's dead, Bobby. Gary's gone. The little girl will never know him. She'll accept any good man as a father. We don't always agree with what Tracy did, but in a way we understand her and love her anyway. You can be such a good man, Bobby. You have to become such a good person. That's what everyone wants. And I think you do too. You just don't know how to admit it to yourself. You think everyone will think less of you for bringing her back and raising the baby as your own. When Mom finished, there were tears in her eyes. Dad looked at me like I was a bullet. Maybe I was the only one who didn't see it. Maybe, but every time I thought about it, I realized I'd never be able to look at myself in the mirror if I did. She cheated on me for months, tried to cheat on me, and had a child with another man. Her saying that sleeping with Gary was compassionate struck me as hollow. A year later, not much had changed in my life. I went to work and came home alone. I didn't go on dates, and my number of friends had greatly diminished. Truth be told, I never had many friends. Tracy had a lot of friends as our couple, but after the divorce, they mostly left me behind. I wasn't surprised that her friends left me, but I was surprised that almost all of our friends left. At least, I was surprised until one of those former friends explained the situation to me. Apparently, Tracy had been telling everyone that I had left her after the baby was born, without mentioning that the baby wasn't mine. I was sitting in a nearby bar, alone of course, when Carl and Susie Dimmick walked in and took a table. Carl and Susie were one of those couples I thought of as our friends, but when I approached their table to say hello, I was greeted very coolly. Susie openly mocked me, and Carl was hardly polite at all. Considering I hadn't done anything to offend them, I was furious at such a poor reception and wasn't about to leave quietly. "What the hell did I do to you two?" I growled. "Not to us, but to Tracy," Susie hissed. "How could you just walk away from the sweetest woman in the world because she had a late baby? You suck, you know that." "Is that what this is about?" I said, almost in shock. "How about we listen to the whole story and then decide for ourselves?" They both motioned for me to sit down, but I was too excited and just stood in front of their table. I leaned closer because I didn't want to yell. "I can only assume that no one told you that the late baby you're talking about is not my baby, you bastards. She lived with her ex-boyfriend, got knocked up by him, and it's her child. He died of cancer a month after she got pregnant, and she tried to trick me into thinking it was my baby. 24 years of marriage, and that's the kind of respect and devotion I get. So no, I didn't leave her. She left me. To hell with her, to hell with both of you, and to hell with the horse you came in on. I left two stunned former friends at the table. My second Christmas as a divorced guy started out just like the first. This year's Christmas Eve Losers Club at Barnes& Noble consisted of 4 people. Me, another guy, and 2 women. I looked at my book and sized up the women. One had curly red hair, freckles, and a pretty face, and the other, wow, why was she here? She was beautiful, to say the least. An Asian woman with waist-length black hair and curves hidden under a sweatshirt and skinny jeans. She had perfect, ageless skin, and I guessed her to be somewhere between 50-55 years old. I watched her for about a minute and then decided to hell with it. All she could do was say no. I grabbed my book and latte and headed over to her. She looked up when I was already within speaking distance. I didn't see you here last Christmas night. You're new to the Losers Club on Christmas Eve. I'm Bobby, the president of the club. What brings a beautiful woman to this momentous day? She giggled at my lame joke, and it was the most delightful sound I'd heard in a long time. I continued. I know you won't believe this, but I have a second Hungry Man dinner in the freezer that I can heat up tonight if you haven't made a reservation yet. I know we just met, but I threw my best puppy dog look at her, hoping I remembered how to do it. Well, I don't usually do anything like this, but since you're the president of the club and you say Hungry Man, yes, I agree. By the way, my name is Angel Wong. Bobby Martin, club president, at your service. I gave her my address and told her to meet me at 6. I left to put the dinners in the oven. I was already heating up both dinners when she showed up at 6 sharp. I had to admit to myself that maybe we were both a little crazy. We ate dinner at the kitchen table and drank Burgundy. I told her how I'd ended up at Barnes & Noble on Christmas Eve, and then she told me her story. She was 5 years older than me, 52 years old, and had been divorced for 10 years after leaving an abusive husband. She and her husband had been married for 16 years, with his abuse starting after 10 years and continuing until he sent her to the hospital with a broken jaw. Angel was a short woman who was 5'1" and weighed about 100 pounds. Her ex was 5'2" and weighed about 120 pounds, she said. He was often bullied as a child and became loud and rude in stressful situations. After 10 years of marriage, this escalated to physical abuse. But when he calmed down, he always apologized and asked for forgiveness. Like many abused women, she just couldn't bring herself to break up with her husband, believing that she was the cause of his abuse. When she woke up in the hospital after another argument, she realized she had to divorce him for her own physical safety. Her husband was convicted of battery and spent 2 years in prison before completely disappearing from her life. They divorced while he was in prison. Fortunately, they had no children. By her own admission, Angel didn't go out much after the divorce, and she had no relatives in this part of the country. She admitted, holding back tears, that Christmas has always been the most depressing time of the year for her. I know it was crazy of me to agree to come here tonight, but I just didn't want to be alone. And how could I turn down dinner with the hungry man? She explained. At Barnes & Noble, I was feeling sorry for myself, but after talking to Angel, I realized that I was still better off than many others. We sat on my couch together, drank wine, and watched a few Christmas movies, starting with the Dickensian version of Mr. Magoo, A Christmas Carol. I knew there was something special about this woman when she completely agreed with my opinion that Mr. Magoo was the definitive Scrooge. We then watched The Grinch, and about halfway through It's a Wonderful Life, I noticed that she had fallen asleep. She had a smile on her face and looked so peaceful that I got a big blanket out of the closet, covered her half, and got under the other half. I must have fallen asleep at some point too, but when I woke up, we were no longer asleep, but sitting side by side. I don't know exactly how it happened, but when I woke up, we were lying side by side, Angel's head on my chest and half of her body on top of mine. I wrapped one arm around her, pulling her tightly against me, and slipped my other hand into my back pocket. It was snowing on the TV. Strangely, it felt so right. I lay like that, cuddling Angel while she slept, for another 20 minutes. She stirred and slowly opened her eyes, looking at me in confusion. I leaned my head back as far as I could and kissed her nose gently. She wrinkled her nose adorably and then gave me the brightest smile I'd seen in years. "Good morning?" she asked timidly. Merry Christmas, I replied, squeezing her tighter in my arms. We lay together, not moving and smiling, for another 5 minutes before she finally spoke. I've never done this before, I swear, she protested, her cheeks practically blazing red hot. But is it just me, or do you feel it too? I grinned at her from ear to ear. Hell yeah, I feel it. I thought about how crazy this was. I just met this woman and we were already having such a good time together. Then I looked up and saw her looking at me and realized she was thinking the same thing. This may be crazy, I started, but it doesn't sound like you have any plans for tonight, since I have everything I need for a first-class Christmas dinner. And if I'm going to go through all this trouble, it certainly doesn't hurt to have a beautiful woman sitting across from me at the table. Her smirk turned into a wide grin that made my heart snap. I need to shower, and I didn't bring a change of clothes. I can run home for a few minutes and come right back, she said. I smiled back at her. I'm sure I have a shirt or something that will fit you. Her almond-shaped eyes flashed. If you can tolerate me without makeup, I don't mind, she said. We took showers. I found one of my little sweaters for her. Looks great, I said. We walked to the kitchen and I poured each of us a glass of Riesling, starting to prepare the food. Angel sat down at the kitchen table, put both her legs up so that half of her ass was visible, and distracted me. So you really have nowhere to go tonight? To your family? Nothing? She asked. I was actually invited to a big family Christmas dinner this year, but I told her I had a previous engagement, I replied. My ex is gathering everyone at my old house. The kids, my mother-in-law, my mother-in-law, my mother-in-law, her mother-in-law, Gary's mother-in-law. It's a setup. She'll make sure I'm holding her adorable baby boy. All the parents will tell me to man up, and she'll tell me she loves me and needs me, and we can find each other again. I told her I had a previous engagement, but everyone knows I'm lying. I told her I would try to hold out for a while longer if I could. None of them understand me. I didn't lie. I don't need to apologize for Tracy cheating and ruining everything. We had something special until we didn't. But if we're talking about something special, why don't we talk about us? We both smiled. I walked over to Angel and we kissed hard. At that moment, I heard the key jingle in the lock of my door, and the door opened. My son walked in and called out to me. Angel and I froze mid-kiss. Daddy, he called out, barely noticing us. Oh, God. He looked at us kissing. Jeffrey immediately turned his back to us, ostensibly to preserve Angel's modesty, though I think he was as embarrassed as she was. Mom knows I have a key to your apartment, and she asked me to come here and drag you back to the house for Christmas dinner because she was sure you were sitting here alone and acting pathetic. Well, I guess you told the truth about your previous engagement, and it could hardly be called pathetic. I apologize if I interfered. You weren't interrupting anything but my Christmas preparations, I said, perhaps a little too quickly as Angle, and I exchanged confused looks. Jeffrey, I need you to turn around so I can properly introduce you to Angel. My Angel. Jeffrey reluctantly turned and headed for the kitchen. Jeffrey, being a Redditor, couldn't help himself. He glanced at Angel again and then gave me what I would call a nod of admiration. It's nice to meet you, Angel. And thank you for coming for my father, Jeffrey said. It's my pleasure, Jeffrey. Your dad is a great guy, Angel replied. Yeah, looks like someone in our family forgot about him for a while, he said. Did everyone like the presents I brought? I asked, changing the subject. How did Bobby G like her presents? You still have talent, Dad. Everyone likes their stuff. The kid likes what you bought. You wouldn't believe how many things she got under the tree when all three grandparents were there. Okay, I replied. Jeffrey said he had to go. He nodded to Angel and I hugged him tightly. New Year's Eve? I asked. I promise Angel will be wearing more clothes. Oh yeah, he replied, blushing thickly. When Jeffrey left, Angel cast a hard look at me. That wasn't too awkward, was it? She asked. And what's the deal with New Year's Eve? I'm not invited first? No, not this time, I said. But where else would my fiancé be on New Year's Eve? Pretty sure, isn't it? She asked. Be even more confident when you pick out your ring tomorrow morning at the Ciaro store. Will you let me go home first so I can get dressed? If you insist, I said, trying to look disappointed. The next morning, Angel chose an engagement ring with a 1-carat marquise cut diamond. We had lunch, after which I called my son and then my parents with the news of the engagement. My son seemed very happy for me, but my parents not so much. I think they were still under the illusion that I would bring Tracy back and raise her child as my own. "This is so unexpected, isn't it, honey?" Mom asked. My mom asked, "Are you sure you're not doing this to mess with Tracy? You know she still loves you, don't you, honey?" "Mom, I'm not trying to hurt anyone. And as for Tracy still loving me, her actions speak for themselves, don't they?" Tracy loves Tracy. I didn't bother to tell my daughter that. We rebuilt our relationship a little, but she was still on her mother's side, insisting that Tracy's act was heroic and explained by love. I figured she would find out sooner or later and call me to speak out in favor of her mother over my choice. After more than 25 years together with Tracy, my relationship with Angel didn't make sense. I couldn't explain how attracted we were to each other and how well she fit into my life. We could talk about anything, and I felt like we had been together forever. I didn't believe in love at first sight, but everything said it was. Angel wasn't a child either, and she seemed as confused by our instant and deep attraction as I was. We spent a lot of time exploring the situation at first, but then we realized we were sucking the life out of it and should just let it flow naturally. Naturally, everything was fine. A month later, she moved in with me, and for the next 6 months, we were rarely separated. Mom and Dad seemed to like her, even though she wasn't Tracy, but Kaylee didn't hide her dislike, probably because she still wanted me to get back together with her mother. 6 months later, we had a small wedding for ourselves. I invited both kids and my parents, and Angel invited a cousin and a friend and their families. For the small celebration, I booked a party room at one of my favorite restaurants. It was a great day, except that Kaylee cornered me and asked why Tracy and Bobby G and my former in-laws weren't invited. "Because your mother is my ex-wife and inviting her would be disrespectful to Angel. Besides, you seem to forget that we're not friends. Ex-sons-in-law don't get invited either." Angel and Tracy finally met 2 years later when Kaylee was getting married. Tracy planned and executed a beautiful event, and I happily paid for everything. Angel, being a beautiful, intelligent, and classy lady, stayed out of the mother of the bride's business and her plans. My only role in the wedding, aside from being the financier, was to traditionally walk the bride down the aisle. My heart was overflowing with pride, and my internal memory machine was working overtime. Several times I looked at Tracy and remembered her and Kaylee doing coloring books and baking cookies. It reminded me that things weren't all bad between us. We'd had 24 good years. Angel understood me perfectly and gave me a hug as we sat in the church pew. I turned toward her, and she pressed her lips gently against mine. It was then that I realized I could make it through the rest of the day. Angel had only interacted with Tracy out of necessity during the rehearsal dinner and the wedding, but not out of fear, but out of dignity. Tracy, for her part, walked around with an annoyed look whenever she looked in Angel's direction. I later learned that she and all 6 grandparents believed that she had usurped Tracy's rightful place and that their marriage was short-lived. Epilogue. Our short-lived marriage had just crossed the 25-year mark. Angel and I celebrated with a nice dinner and a quiet evening. Looking back, I can't complain about the way life has treated me. I had a good first, married for 24 years. Then I went back and have been in a second marriage for 25 years. 2 of my children are married and have given me 3 beautiful grandchildren. Tracy never married. According to my children, not many men were interested in a middle-aged woman with a young child, even if she looked good. In their opinion, she must have had some acquaintances along the way, or she might have killed someone by now. My kids make sure to keep in touch with both Tracy and their half-sister. The child's 3 grandparents also tried to give her all their love until they started dying of old age. My son, the only family member who had regular contact with me after the divorce, told me that for the first 5 years after the wedding, Tracy didn't even go on dates, believing that my marriage wouldn't last. I'm sure Angel was sorry to disappoint her. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.